Hey, good afternoon. We're going to begin. Today is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker, Stephan Nicoleau, to the seminar today. And it's a special seminar because it's hosted both by the Perspectives on Climate Change seminar series and by the Cornell 2030 project. If you don't know about the 2030 project, Ben Furness will come up here in just a few minutes and give a more formal introduction to the speaker and to this project. Okay. But just a few words if you're not familiar with the climate change seminar series. Seminar series is open as a class and it's also open to the public. There's a seminar almost every Monday, as many of you know, throughout the spring semester. And the goal of this series is to provide a diverse set of perspectives on climate change, mitigation, law, agriculture, philosophy, etc. And this has been our 8th year, actually, of running the seminar series, which means we've had more than 100 speakers in here. And most speakers are available on video on the Atkinson website. So looking back for 8 years, there's been a really clear evolution of talks. 8 years, most of the talks were sort of theoretical, talked about climate change in abstract. And today now we're talking more about climate change solutions. How do we solve this problem? And in that vein, Stephan has a really interesting talk about how to actually approach it and help solve it. So now, Ben.
Thanks so much, Professor Hess. And if you're not aware, those of you joining on Zoom, we are joining BEE 2000 Perspectives on the Climate Change Challenge today. So really want to thank Professor Hess and all of you for having us here. My name is Ben Furness. I'm the Executive Director of the 2030 Project, which is a university-wide initiative here at Cornell designed to accelerate and support impact-oriented climate research that's happening in all of the colleges. So here at Cornell, faculty and students are working hard to reduce emissions from food systems, to decarbonize energy, to develop the next generation of critical materials, and to develop policies and partnerships with workers and communities to make sure that these transformations lead to good jobs and healthy lives. I don't need to tell the folks in this room the importance of this work. Just last week, the IPCC's 6th synthesis report sort of reiterated the urgency and the importance of taking pretty dramatic action to reduce our contributions to climate change. And it's really gonna take a lot from all of us. So here in a university setting, we're working to accelerate the development of new technologies to provide the best available information to decision makers and to help train the next generation of climate and energy leaders. This is a really exciting moment for this work, and I know it inspires me and inspires a lot of us here. The federal government here in the United States has passed major climate and energy legislation, hundreds of billions of dollars to accelerate decarbonization and support the development and deployment of next generation technologies. And industries and investors are really leaping into this new challenge with billions in private capital. And that's really why I'm so excited to have Stephan Nicoleau here. Stephan is a thought leader who works across sectors to align policy, capital, and innovation for climate impact. He is the general partner of FullCycle, a sustainable infrastructure fund that prioritizes fast-acting climate pollutants, and a member of the board of directors for Project Drawdown, a nonprofit organization that has built one of the most enduring climate solutions frameworks. He's also advises the leadership of the Departments of State and Energy on climate policy and implementation, and is currently leading the ASTRA project, a cross-sectoral collective aligning action at the intersection of methane reduction, nature-based solutions, and climate financing. Closer to home, he's also a visiting impact practitioner at Cornell Tech, so he's part of the Cornell family. I'm really thrilled to have you here on campus, Stephan. I've had a great morning with you so far, have some great conversations, and really looking forward to this conversation, so welcome.
Thank you. I want to make sure, can you hear me all right? Is this working? I think so. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for having me. I got to say, I've just had the most incredible day here on campus. So I'm really grateful for all of the time and attention, and most importantly, your interest in this topic area of how we start to think about solutions for this big problem of climate change. My name is Stephan Nicoleau. I come to this work with an intersectional lens for how we can solve this problem. So I do my day job of course, investing in climate solutions and think kind of holistically around how do we effectuate a low carbon transition that will be both just and achievable. How do we start to realize some of our ambitions to reduce emissions and transition to a world that works better for everyone? So that's, my lens is how we start to think collectively around our actions, both as individuals and as institutions, and start to co-create a future that perhaps looks different than the one on which we are on a trajectory. I also, think more broadly through my work at Project Drawdown around the solutions that are not investable, right? Not everything's investable, but could be highly effective for a low carbon world. And so through Project Drawdown, we start to think about the policies, the early stage technologies, the practices in different sectors that we'll walk through today. And ultimately, the title of this talk, as it were, is how do we start to think about a roadmap for climate action, right? We are now in a time period where time is our most precious resource. And so thinking about the order of operations, if we remember our calculus and our arithmetic from high school, the order of operations, as it were, for effectuating a low carbon transition will matter greatly. We're out of time to do all the things to see what works and then to dovetail into and dive into the things that are effective. We really have to start thinking about a more cohesive strategy. And so that's the work that I do kind of in my day-to-day. And, I think one of the things that's really important here is kind of the intersections between public sector and private sector, between academia and commercial and markets, and start to really braid and weave our ambitions together. So I hope to share with you today a couple of ways that we think about this, both technologically as investments, that we think about the role of nature. We start to think about policy as an effectuator to engage populations and capital and really start to create something new and different for us all. Professor Hess asked me to talk a little bit about my background, how I got here. I think it's really important in this room because ultimately some of you, or hopefully all of you, will graduate from Cornell and think about your role in the world, and hopefully you go into sustainability writ large, or go into markets where at least you can play your role, both as individuals and as parts of systems. So I started my career in the capital markets. I was a consultant to large investment banks. My tutelage was inside of institutions like JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank and Credit Suisse. Two of those three will likely no longer exist in a couple of months, but it's not from our work or from our doing, and instead is problems that are far beyond my pay grade. But I started my career there, and it taught me how capital is a resource that we can move for great good or for great harm. And it really just depends on how we focus our time and attention in doing so. And then I then moved on to working on what we call the buy side. So how do investors play into all of this? And I play a role now as an investor, so that was great for me to understand how you move capital to effectuate positive change and to really think about how capital can be a great resource and how we are stewards of capital to make all of that work. That was my path, my climate journey, as it were. But I will say everyone has their entry point into this market, right? And you will too, if you so choose to go into climate, the big umbrella. And there's no single way to get into this space. So when folks ask me how to do it, I say, figure out what your superpower or superpowers are. What are the things that you really care about, that you're passionate about, that you're good at, and apply that to climate at any level, at a fund, at a startup, at a law firm, wherever it may be. This really is an all hands on deck effort. And so we hope that we engage and include as many people as possible in those efforts. Small plug, there's a podcast called My Climate Journey, and I did an episode for them, and you can hear more about my background there, so I won't dovetail into too much of it much further. But I do want to share kind of what I'm currently working on and the things that the entities that I'm currently affiliated with. So FullCycle is our fund. I'll talk a little bit about our strategy later, but it ostensibly was an innovator in how you think about a venture fund, a real asset fund that's pointed at climate. We were early in the space and started to have conversations that helped us create a lane that now many, many funds operate in. And so, that's one way that we bring to bear our market. Project Drawdown, I spoke of as a resource. I'm part of the Cornell family, as was part of my introduction. So grateful to be here. And then the Astra Project is where we house all of our public sector and private sector and policy ambitions to line up capital and resources to public sector commitments. So today, hopefully we get to frame a little bit of the climate problem. We can talk about solutions, implementation, and finally a call to action for all of you. That's right, everyone plays a role, and so we are hopeful that we can highlight what role you can possibly play in this fight of ours to stabilize our climate. So here's the problem, right? We have done a pretty poor job maintaining what we know to be a stable environment for our climate and create the conditions for human progress to continue for the next 100, 200, 500 years. And you can see this chart showing the years going by in post-industrial era, doing a tremendous amount of planetary warming as destabilizing many of our planetary systems and causing not just warming, but biodiversity loss, sea ice loss, and other conditions that are not conducive for our flourishing and for our thriving. So we've got to think about how we reverse this trend, or rather go on a different trajectory from this current point of our trend. And the thing about it that gives me hope, and I hope gives all of you hope, is that we know exactly where the emissions are coming from, right? There's no mystery here, right? We understand that, in big sectors like food and ag and electricity and industry, we have the opportunity to really see very specifically where the most harmful greenhouse gases are coming from. And that is a lot of power, right? There's power in knowing. And I'm sure others have come and shown diagrams like this, and so it's nothing new for all of you, but suffice it to say, once you know, you can't unknow. And once you understand the sources of emissions, it gives you a good start as to how we can start to address those problematic areas. But there's a couple of things that we needed to understand when we were crafting our investment thesis at FullCycle that I want to share with you here so that we can all get on the same page. Ben mentioned earlier the AR6 report from the IPCC. If there's any acronyms that are unfamiliar, stop me and I'll explain them. We are swimming in acronym soup in our industry, alphabet soup. But what we wanted to know for understanding and looking at apples to apples comparisons of technologies and their ability to abate emissions is what's the time frame that we should be focusing on. And so the first thing to highlight here, the first opportunity to think about how we can all get on the same page is looking at the data on a 100-year basis shows us a snapshot of the problem. But I think what we're all seeing and feeling is that perhaps the problem is more intense than the data at a 100-year metric would show. So instead, we decided to take a look at what happens to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, not on a 100-year basis, but on a 20-year basis. And when you shrink that time frame down to a more digestible 20 years, it gives you a better sense or a different snapshot of the problem. You start to see that not only are the most harmful greenhouse gases doing their most harm in those first 20 years, but in fact, they degrade into CO2 over time. And you have this funny set of curves that compound upon each other. Say it all to say that on a 20-year basis, you get a much more accurate picture, and it helps you to prioritize those solutions that we know about so that you can deal with the worst of the problem soonest. So we had to think about what the GWP20, that stands for the global warming potential on a 20-year basis of a molecule looked like. And here's one of the key differences. So we'll talk a little bit today about methane. And on a 100-year basis, methane is about 21 times worse than CO2 at trapping heat. But on a 20-year basis, it's 86 times more heat trapping than CO2. I know that says 85, it's somewhere around there. So suffice to say, that's a big gap. It's a big difference. And so focusing on a 20-year basis gives you not only a better snapshot, but tells you where you should focus your attention. And methane is certainly one of the areas where we should be focusing our attention. And so this is a good articulation of that, right? So what you see here on this first bar chart is the mass of our emissions, right? By mass, how much we're emitting. And all of this bar chart of CO2 and this little piece here are all of the short-lived climate pollutants like methane, like nitrous oxides, like refrigerants. But on their warming potential, you can see that that small number, that 1% of greenhouse gases accounts for nearly 46% of the warming. So this is that asymmetry that I'm talking about between what we actually know to be the worst greenhouse gases and right-sizing them on a time frame that really tells us what's happening in our upper atmosphere. And so, thinking about where we should focus our limited time, our resources, our capital, this highlights a real area where we can start to do some meaningful work. So some people get dismayed or get sad about statistics like this. I see opportunity, right? Here's an opportunity to identify a lever for action and give us an opportunity to really prioritize where we focus our time and attention that gives us a lens of efficacy, prioritization that's really important. So we'll share this deck, and so you should have to copy any of this down. But you can look at the variation of sources of the different greenhouse gases relative to carbon dioxide and realize if you're going to focus on methane, for example, focusing in ag, energy, and waste is almost the whole game, right? That's 3 sectors, not 20, not 40. And that gives you an opportunity to think about other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxides and refrigerants, where you can also focus the majority of your attention on practices, on solutions, on investments, not scattershot across many sectors, but highly focused, tactically and implemented in key sectors and key areas of our economy that are emissions intensive for these particular short-lived climate pollutants. That's what SLCP stands for up there. So suffice to say, once you know, you can't unknow. And so this is knowledge that's really powerful when we think about how we guide policy, how we make investments, and how we spend our time and attention focusing on a pretty large problem of a destabilizing climate. And of course, methane, as we said, we talked about earlier, is a key lever, right? Here we can kind of see a projected emissions curve with methane and nitrous oxide abatement and without. And while that doesn't seem like a huge gap, this is degrees of temperature warming. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the goal of keeping our planetary warming to below 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's a world where we can deal with the conditions. It's still not pretty, but we can work with it. Once we go above 1.5, we're in a world that you and I don't really recognize, that is a bit unstable, too unstable for progress of humanity to continue. And so we want to make sure we have every possible shot at keeping our warming below 1.5. And methane is a key lever here, right? Reducing methane by 30% can knock off 0.3 to 0.5 degrees of warming by the 2040s. And that's a lot of space that we can then start to utilize and create new solutions, new initiatives to reduce methane and other greenhouse gases more. And the thing about methane is that most of the solutions that we would implement for its mitigation are super low tech, right? They are things like new and different agricultural practices, things like dealing with waste, manure waste, and ruminant animals very much. I know there's a large focus here on campus around ruminant cows and methane emissions related to their burps and farts. Not something perhaps you think you say in a university environment. But there's a lot of attention focused on kind of the dairy industry generally. And in waste, I mean, we all generate waste. The average American generates about 5 pounds of waste per day, and a lot of that is biogenic. It's the apple core and the banana peel and the scraps from our lunch that we typically throw away. All of that waste goes to landfill and eventually degrades and emits methane into the atmosphere. So waste is a huge driver of methane emissions. But if you think about where we have the opportunity for scale, you again don't have to focus on every country in the world and every place in the world or every sector in the world. You could focus on the top 20 emitters, of course, the United States being chief amongst them, China as well, and you can capture almost 68% of the global methane emissions. So again, taking this big problem and shrinking it down to components that we can get our hands around, get our understanding around, is one of the keys here. Is we can start to identify a molecule, its sectors, which countries it comes from, and suddenly we have something of a roadmap, or the beginnings of a roadmap. We know where to focus our time and attention, and that's really important. So this is from our friends at Project Drawdown. And part of the genesis of that project, if you haven't perused the website or perhaps seen the book, is to really understand the bevy of solutions. What's the buffet from which we can nibble and identify which solutions are most effective? But the reality is this curve here is where we are, and this bright red line is where we need to go. So it's not enough to know what solutions to invest in or to deploy. we also have to understand the emergency brake, as it were, right? The solutions that are most effective at decarbonizing industry soonest, so that we have the best shot beyond 2050 to keep warming below 1.5 by 2100. And so these emergency brakes are things like slowing ecosystem degradation, right? Cutting methane leaks and other short-lived climate pollutants, right? And building into our existing and our forthcoming infrastructure efficiencies that we haven't previously considered, right? How do you heat, cool, insulate, and warm buildings in ways that are not emissions intensive and don't require tons of energy will be a big driver of how we save on our emissions footprint. And then finally, food waste, right? So we talked a little bit about that before, and that's kind of a big piece for the human component to all of this, right? We are big consumers of food, obviously, but so are the animals that we raise, right? So we spend a lot of time raising crops for chickens and cows to consume so that we can eat their high protein flesh. And so, how we think about changing our diets will play a huge role in all of this. And ultimately, there's a lot of talk around kind of some of the technologies in this green line. You can see carbon removal projects. People talk about carbon capture, the ability to suck the air out of the atmosphere, capture the carbon, and then deal with the rest. But the reality is, at full tilt, is a very small component of what this actual drawdown needs to look like. So at Drawdown, we think very intensely about the roadmap, and the first part of it is pulling the emergency brake that has these components to it. But ultimately, there are other solutions that we need to implement in addition to pulling those emergency brakes, right? So new low carbon systems. I'll talk about some of the technologies in which we invest on a basis for FullCycle. There's social interventions. So things like focusing our time and attention, especially in markets where you have a big disparity between education of women and girls and young boys. And you can think about family planning and how we give folks the most optionality for family planning as one of the vectors for how we solve for climate change. And then, of course, nature-based removal. Al Gore has a really funny quote where he says, all this technology coming out to capture carbon is great, but we already have the technology to do so. It's called a tree, right? He's being facetious, but the point is that nature has been doing this for millennia, right? And so our best shot at sequestering carbon and creating more carbon sinks is actually stewarding, conserving, and regenerating our natural environment, our nearshore ecosystems, our mangroves, our boreal forests, our rainforests. These are active sinks, but they need active management. I'll touch on that in a little bit. And then, of course, new technologies, right? Thank God we're in this era where we have the technological capabilities to do a lot, more so than ever before. So we leave a lot of room for new technologies to come online and eventually get to the point where they too can sequester gigatons, billions of tons of emissions, and play their role in architecting this down curve to a better world. So stop point, let's think about the role of natural systems for a little bit. Nature has the capacity to sequester gigatons and gigatons, 100 billion tons of CO2 annually and its equivalents annually. So our ability to actually conserve and regenerate nature can create the conditions not only for nature to be a carbon sink, but actually gives us the opportunity to stop the feedback loops that sometimes go out of control, right? So thinking about, for example, sea ice loss, right? The less ice you have on the planet, the less of a reflective surface you have bouncing those the sun's rays out back into the space. And so you have actually a negative positive feedback loop. It's poorly named. A positive feedback loop is bad. And so you have a condition where you have less reflective sea ice driving additional warming. So we've got to think about some of these feedback loops that exist in nature and find our opportunities to lever the ability for nature to sequester as much as possible in the shortest time frame possible. And I mentioned earlier that I focus my time and thinking and attention kind of on the most inclusive possible low carbon transition. And so part of that is identifying that just about 5% of our global population, mostly indigenous communities all around the world, steward 80% of the world's biodiversity. And the reason that matters is because the more biodiverse an ecosystem, the healthier that ecosystem is, the more you have the conditions of active carbon sequestration in that ecosystem. So that, again, is kind of that little bit of a lever point where you have the opportunity to focus on a much smaller subset of the problem and have an outsized impact that would otherwise take a long time to steward. So indigenous wisdom, indigenous engagement, and the conservation of indigenous lands is really important for activating and preserving nature's ability to sequester carbon and stabilize our climate. So decarbonization requires aligning capital towards these emergency brakes. We'll talk a little bit about where we know the cuts to be. This is just a different representation of that circular chart before. But what's interesting is that, again, we know the solutions. You gotta tilt your head this way, but actually, here's a good identification of the most pressing areas, in industry, for example. All of these high heat processes to create cement and steel and aluminum are incredibly emissions intensive, but the technologies to decarbonize them are available to us. So knowledge is power here, and we have the ability to now think about what's the solution set. This is just a sampling of it, but it gives us a good sense as to how we can think about the sources of our time, the uses of our time, and the abilities for us to figure out what solutions we focus on for a second and third. So I want to show you something relative to these direct emissions cuts and sources of emissions. That is maybe our second or third learning as a fund, to identify where's the capital. Where is it focused? Where are we deploying capital? And where perhaps are we misaligned to knowing exactly where the emissions are coming from? And so this is where we see philanthropy showing up every year. And what you'll see is there's mostly lined up to where we have emissions, but there's a whole lot of philanthropy going to carbon capture technologies. That's what that says under the Cornell host thing there. That is way outsized relative to the role that carbon capture can possibly play in this framework of where emissions are coming from. So we haven't really right-sized the philanthropic capital to where the problems are coming from. And that, we want to give ourselves the best possible shot at figuring out this large issue by focusing our time well, right? If you have an exam tomorrow, you probably aren't going to focus on your homework for 2 weeks from now. You probably want to think about studying for that exam tomorrow. Kind of the same analogy here. And so in my world, here is where venture capital is focusing most of its time and capital, right? A lot of you know about VC. You probably think about, going into that world if you want to be an investor. Well, what we can see is that in the 2021, 2022 era, we have so much capital going towards transportation. You hear about investments in EVs like Tesla and scooter companies like Lyft and all these technologies that are great, but aren't right. The capital isn't right sized to where we actually have the emissions coming from. These are great opportunities. Folks are going to make a lot of money, but it may not have the effect that we're looking for in terms of stabilizing our climate and reducing emissions. So if we're going to give ourselves our best shot, we've got to start to right size the capital. And this is key understanding to think about how we start to talk to the financial sector and maybe play our role in galvanizing actions so that we have more capital going towards industry, for example, than we see here in venture. Let me pause for a second. By show of hands, how many folks here have heard about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act? All right, so some of us, not so many of us. So this is a piece of legislation that passed in August of last year. It is the United States' largest, by far and away our largest effort to tackle climate from the government lens. So subsidies and incentives and grants and capital. And it's a landmark legislation. And it's something we should collectively be proud of. We went through a couple of years where we didn't think climate was very much of a priority for the presidential administration, but here's an administration that's taking it seriously, politics aside. But even the IRA is outsized in sectors that are not aligned to where the emissions are coming from. So we've got a lot of work to do to line up our resources most effectively to make sure that we're focusing on the emissions that are most important, and we don't have an outsized amount of policy or capital relative to where the emissions are coming from. We've got to give ourselves the best shot, and this articulates that we haven't quite set about the stage to do that yet. Okay, so we know we have a little bit to do on the allocation side, but what are the solutions that we should be investing in? How do we start to think about a world where it's about implementation and less so about fantasy technologies or about things that maybe won't come to fruition over time? And one thing we wanted to share from our FullCycle experience is, again, this kind of relationship now in the universe of climate tech, so zeroing in on the technologies a little bit, that kind of show the same point as before, but in our universe, right? So right now it's about 75% of the investments going to about 20% of the technologies, right? That means the remainder 80% have to scramble for a very small amount of the pie. And again, it's not right sized to the emissions. So what you see here is the total amount of capital going from our sector into climate technologies that are all great, or mostly great. But then here's their share of the greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see industry, waste, agriculture, even energy, not really getting the bulk of the capital necessary. Specifically, not energy so much, but the built environment. That's this building, right? How do we cool and heat this building and make sure that it can keep those the stabilized temperature in a way that doesn't require an outsized amount of energy. So, even in our sector, when we think about climate tech and venture capital, we are not right sized to the problem, and that's something that we have to fix if we're going to give ourselves a fair shot. And what's interesting about this is that when we think about climate tech, most people think about solar and wind, right? Technologies are very familiar. I'm sure you can drive along the landscape here around Ithaca and see solar installations and see wind farms, and that's all well and good, but there's a whole universe of sustainable infrastructure that typically does not get the capital or is not yet down that decline curve of costs that solar and wind has been the beneficiary of. Solar has been around for a long time, so is wind, and we're only now starting to see what's called price parity, right? So the cost of developing these infrastructures, this infrastructure and building out that infrastructure to generate power has come down to be at parity with natural gas or coal or other sources of power in most places in the world. But there's a whole suite of sustainable infrastructure that has not yet benefited from coming down the cost curve or going up the efficiency curve. And so we focus our time on this new class of sustainable infrastructure, right? This is waste to value and circularity solutions, how you turn waste into materials or chemicals of value over and over again. These are sustainable ag operations that can produce in 1 year 4 harvests, not one, and can produce more efficiently that food that we will eat every day than typical agricultural practices might. So there's a whole universe that we can invest in, that we can grow, that will be the beneficiary of that capital, and from which we will also benefit as consumers of the power or the energy or the clothing that gets made from sustainable fibers, for example. But there's a key problem. For most of these startups, there's something called a deployment gap. What does that mean? Okay, so say you're a startup founder. You've got a new technology you're very excited about, and you build your first of a kind plant, right? You're very excited about it. It's a very complex slide, but I'll break it down. Typically, a lot of that happens over here, right? And in fact, universities play a role in funding a lot of this early development. And there's a bit of a gap here between getting your first demonstration of your technology out into the market and being fully commercialized and ready for market. And so a lot of companies die on the vine here. And you can see the risk curve goes down. It gets less risky to invest in companies as they grow, as they develop their technology, as they have more demonstrations of it. But indeed, the ability to accelerate those technologies will come from filling this gap and playing a critical role with companies to help them bridge from early stage to fully commercialized. When I say fully commercialized, I mean someone will pay you as a customer for the thing that you're outputting, the power or the waste or materials or whatever it might be. And so we play a critical role here in filling this deployment gap and built this model, purpose-built it for companies specifically facing that little bit of a challenge, that deployment gap that we know very well. And so our approach has been one to really solve the problems within the problem, right? And start to plug those gaps. So we built this model, again, to kind of fill that deployment gap, to give companies the best shot at reaching the status of the kind of companies that you and I know very well because they're public and mostly because they deliver value to us every day. And then the second was, again, focusing on the most harmful molecules. So if you just focus on everything in CO2 land, you've got a large amount of stuff you can do, but not all of it is highly effective. Whereas if you focus on molecules like methane, as I mentioned earlier, you have the opportunity to be both efficient and to prioritize your solutions. And then commercialization, right? It's okay to have one solar farm, but that doesn't really create the conditions for solar to take over and provide us clean and renewable power. you need this kind of infrastructure everywhere in the world. And that's called commercialization. So how do you actually do that for the most critical technologies? And then how do you fund that deployment gap that we talked about earlier? So our model is built to accelerate this curve and bring the technologies here to commercialization earlier than they would have ordinarily had the chance to do. And that's just our way of solving the problem in such a way that gives us the best possible shot at deploying capital. And so here's a little bit about how we've done what we do. I'll go through each company very quickly, and then again, we'll share these slides. You can go on our website and learn more about the companies we're investing in. But here we work on we're invested in a company called Sonova. Sonova is in waste transformation. So how do you take all the waste in a landfill and actually capture all of that calorific value, all those calories, all those molecules of value that would otherwise degrade into methane actually can turn into materials to make this desk, or fuels to power a power station renewably, or other materials that are of value in our global economy. So Sonova solves that problem. It's a Dutch technology that can take waste in and then convert it to many kinds of molecules on the other side and do so in a low temperature, highly efficient way. Sustainatech is indoor and controlled environment ag. So again, how do you produce food for a growing population, 8-9 billion people by 2050? How do you produce enough food for folks will be an answer that is in part addressed technologically, not just by our practices and our diets. And so Sustainatech creates, very highly nutritious food in a distributed fashion that allows us to think about answering that question. In pipe, so I'm assuming most people here do not have children. If you do have children, you're not supposed to have a favorite one. So I will not say that this is my favorite investment. It probably is. And so In pipe creates a unit that sits inside of a municipal water supply. So the pipes out in front of this building. And at the site of a valve where you step down pressure so that the water in the faucet doesn't blow the faucet off the sink, you have energy loss in the form of heat. So instead, this unit sits at that valve and captures the kinetic energy of water moving through that pipe and meters it to power this building. Clean, easy, efficient, easy to understand and install. You can see why folks might be excited about it. And it changes the possibility of an energy mix that is right now very carbon intensive around the country and around the world. It gives us a chance to think about a world that can have clean power from a resource that is undertapped. Evernew is in fashion and textile waste recycling. So you rip a hole in your t-shirt, the first thing you think about is, I'll just throw it away. Well, that cotton or materials made from organic materials goes into a landfill and degrades into methane and becomes part of our waste problem. Well, Evernew can take a lot of that waste and actually convert it to fibers that make new materials for clothing. We just set in place a partnership with Zara, some of you may know. And so their sustainability line is now sourcing fibers from Evernew. And again, we're trying to get these solutions out into market in such a way that it's easy and accessible to engage with them and gives us an opportunity to think about more closed loop systems, as it were. And then Burcell is highly efficient waste separation. So perhaps not our sexiest investment, but for sure one of our most effective. The more homogeneous our waste streams, the more stuff we can do with it. Biogenic waste over here, metals over here, plastics over here, gives us a chance to think about different ways of recycling those materials and not letting them go into our growing waste problem. So at FullCycle, we're really thinking about how do you start to braid these solutions and technologies into our existing industries and allow for consumers, for all of us, to engage with these kinds of technologies as well in a way that's very easy and accessible. So here's the deal. When we focus on methane, which we've done in our fund, you can start to understand the sources and sinks as they exist. And you realize that our methane cycle is a little bit out of balance, a lot of it out of balance, and that we have more emissions coming from our sectors and from our natural systems than we have the capacity to draw those molecules down and bring them into the earth as trees and other organic material do. The one key thing to highlight here that never gets talked about is that a large part of our methane emissions don't just come from our sector's industry, but come from nature. So again, our ability to be good stewards of our natural systems plays a key role in our ability to mitigate methane emissions, right? So conservation and regeneration of our forests and of our nearshore ecosystems plays a huge role in reducing methane emissions. And we've just talked about what a lever reducing methane can be. So the next time someone says, well, being an environmentalist isn't actively managing our emissions, isn't actively managing our warming, they're wrong, right? Actually, this is a great way to think about how you reduce methane emissions, and it is possible. And it's possible by not just our practices and our engagement with nature, but by empowering the indigenous communities that steward so much of those natural systems already. And here's like the period on the end of the sentence. We know where the methane's coming from. We know what solutions we can implement all around this wheel. And we know that taking methane offline will be a high-tech endeavor and mostly a low-tech endeavor. These are things like plugging the leaks in the oil and gas infrastructure. It's about dealing with waste differently. It's about new agricultural practices. This is all achievable. It's all doable. And if there's one message to come away with today, is that everything I'm talking about is a doable endeavor, is not overly ambitious for us to think about as humans today and not push it off into a generation beyond us. This is our job to do, and it is very much achievable. And so I hope we can at least come away with that understanding that if you focus on some of these key sectors and understand the solutions, suddenly this big problem of climate change is actually very manageable and approachable. Okay, so how do we actually think about doing our best efforts at mitigating methane emissions at scale? It's going to require international cooperation. And so what you see here is kind of the global methane pledge that was devised in Glasgow, Scotland, at the United Nations Conference of Parties. How many people have heard of COP26, COP27, the COP process? Okay, good. That's great. I would not have had my hand up in the air when I was in college many years ago. So I appreciate that more folks are aware. What came out of Glasgow was a commitment based on the countries that were present to reduce methane emissions by 30% of 2020 levels by 2030. And that's a big number, but again, it's not hugely ambitious. It's not something that's unachievable, but it requires global cooperation, right? It requires public sector to make the commitment and private sector to take the baton and actually do that work of fulfilling those obligations, of implementing these solutions and doing so in sectors in a prioritized fashion, right? So where the methane emissions matters, how you implement and execute those solutions really matters too. And so we've done a lot of work on the Astra front to do that. Here's just a graphic here. I swear I'm somewhere in this photo, maybe not, but I was there. And so the UN COP is a great opportunity. It's a great stage for us to think about this narrative and this work in the context of policymakers and leaders making commitments that are both realistic and achievable, right? So we want to give ourselves the best possible shot at doing this work. And that's not just on the international context, but a moment ago, we talked about the IRA. And so here's the opportunity to think about domestically moving a gargantuan amount of capital, $390 billion towards methane mitigation, towards climate initiatives, towards landmark opportunities to transform energy and manufacturing, to put heat pumps in every building around the country. There's so much we could be doing that this bill enables, but we've got to figure out how you get that quantum of capital out of the coffers of the federal government and into the hands of individuals, into the hands of institutions, right? Two key things since we're focusing on methane. One, $1.55 billion allocated for methane mitigation. That number is actually quite larger because there's a lot of methane that comes from some of the subsidies that you might see in agriculture and waste. But the key here, so the first time we priced methane, right? So if I'm a large oil and gas company, I really haven't cared too much that I've got methane leaks in my infrastructure. And no one's certainly paying me to cap those wells or to plug those leaks in pipelines or to tighten the bolts, the nuts and bolts in our pumping stations for natural gas. And so now with a price on methane, I have an economic incentive to do that work. So incentives play a huge role in guiding the market towards the activities and actions that we want to see companies take, and pricing methane is the best way we can do that. We didn't put the sub-bullet here, but right now the price is $1,500 a ton of methane, and that's escalating to $2,600 a ton by 2026. That's a good number, right? So if you're emitting lots of tonnage of methane, that's economics that you want to capture, and it starts to dictate what your actions may or may not be in these sectors. Okay, so implementation and capital, right? We know we have the solutions, we know where to focus our time and attention, we understand that we can price things like methane, but how do you actually implement and build into our everyday lives the kinds of solutions that we want to think of? Well, the first is to think about the amount of capital that's necessary to do it all. So the first thing I would point to here is $6.9 trillion gets us there if we start to do that on an annual, deploy that capital on an annual basis. That seems like a gargantuan number. It's not even something you can fathom, $6.9 trillion. It's just, it's words at this point. It's such a large number. The reality is every year, we, the collective we, the royal we, invest over $200 trillion into stuff, right? Into equities, stocks, into bonds, into real estate, into all sorts of things. The 6.9 of 200 is like not that much, right? We're talking about 3 to 4% of the amount we invest. So this is not a question of do we have the capital at all, actually. We have plenty of capital. This is about our ambition to deploy that capital into the sectors that matter most for mitigation and the models that we create that galvanize the markets, move that capital into the markets, into these solutions, right? And the pathways we create, and most importantly, how enduring those pathways are, right? Can we create a model that exists today and 10 years from now that convinces Blackstone and JP Morgan and Vanguard to continually deploy capital into these solutions and into these sectors to the tune of $6.9 trillion, right? Can we do that? I believe the answer is yes. And again, it's because of this relationship between the amount of capital needed, the amount of capital that we have at our disposal. But we are way short currently if we think about sustainable infrastructure relative to traditional infrastructure. Traditional infrastructure is dams and bridges and toll roads. Sustainable infrastructure is everything we've talked about earlier. And so we've got to start to right-size the capital. This brings that point home a little bit. And I think there's something else to be said here, not just on the technological solutions, but in nature, right? So nature-based solutions are key here. And you can kind of see in this graphic here where we're deploying our capital and time relative to nature. And I think the point here is this $100 and change billion is where we are, and this $500 billion is where we need to be. So we've got to close that gap, as swiftly as possible. By creating new economic models for deploying capital into nature, markets start to adapt and say, hey, wait, there's an opportunity there. We can actually start to think about moving capital into the stewardship and regeneration of nature that prices that value that gets created in such a way that you start to move hundreds of billions of dollars more than that which we've already done. There's a real chance here to start to think about how we move capital collectively. And in the context of what we focus on at gatherings like COP26 and COP27, you have an opportunity here to intersect our efforts to reduce methane emissions, to price in and value and invest in nature, and to have conversations that are focused on justice, for example. So loss and damage comes up here in terms of how we find the synergies across our efforts that are climate related. How many of you are familiar with the conversation around losses and damage? Okay, so fewer hands. So let me share why this is so important. So in COP27, there was a big discussion that happened between a number of countries who we might call the most vulnerable of the countries that are low-lying, that are island nations, who are saying, well, wait a minute, a lot of development happened in the global north at the expense of the global south. And if the call for all of us here is to adapt to a changing climate, we're going to need the capital to do so. And so there's a conversation that happened between countries that said, well, where do you get $100 billion or more per year, every year, compounding to start to do those efforts in places like Pakistan? At the time we had this conversation, Pakistan was 35% underwater from flooding. How do you rebuild when you're 35% underwater? And where does that capital come from to do that? And so the conversation around loss and damage is really about the United States, the EU, China, saying, okay, well, we can contribute to a fund that will then get redistributed to Barbados and Ghana and places where you have destabilization not born from the actions taken on shore. And so you start to rebalance the resources necessary for adaptation, right? This was a big deal that we got this even on the discussion, on the agenda, let alone just an active discussion at the United Nations Conference of the Parties. And it's not done yet. This year will be about how you write the equation, how you allocate funds to countries that are in need of this capital to develop. And one of the keys that we came across, and I say the Astra Project and my team that were there participating, is that it's not just figuring out where you get the capital for losses and damages, but in this intersection between methane and nature, you have a lot of opportunity to overlap the capital that we've already allocated to these activities towards the loss and damage conversation, which is a big deal because no one knows where to get that money. And everyone's afraid of kind of thinking about going to perhaps Congress to say, hey, we need some money to give to other countries for losses and damages. You can imagine what kind of conversation that would be in our current political environment. And so the intersection really matters, right? This is an opportunity to think about money allocated, actually giving a chance for folks to adapt in a world that's rapidly changing around them. So when you think about global policy, I think the key here is to think about the intersections providing a lot of opportunity. And I'll share with you that not all policymakers take that as their charge, right? Not all policymakers understand that the intersections matter a lot. So when you're reading about loss and damage later tonight, or when you're thinking about what the UN COP could be, these are really important points to highlight and understand, is that it's the intersections between our efforts that are funded and those that are not, that maybe give us an opportunity to think differently. And the business models by which we start to deploy that capital really matter, right? All right, so call to action. Thanks for sticking with me through all of this. I know I've thrown a lot at you. The most important thing I think for all of us is what can we do here, right? And there's a principle in the United Nations in the framework of the UN. It's called common but differentiated responsibility. That is to say that everyone plays a role in what happens next, but not everyone plays the same role. That institutions, that governments, that private citizens can all participate in a low carbon transition, but our responsibility for effectuating our role in that change and in the transition is not the same as everyone else. It's not the same as different kinds of entities. So people have asked me as individuals, what role can I play in effectuating climate action, right? And the answer is not necessarily one that you might expect. It's actually voting, right? Right now, 535 individuals, 534, I think, until someone comes back, individuals in Congress are responsible for approving or denying climate policy that might effectuate billions of lives. That is a very small number of people responsible who have their hands on the conditions and the fates of so many people around the world. So your ability, not just to vote at the federal level, but to go to your city council, to go to your county level representatives, to go to the state level and challenge your elected officials to have a plan, to know the science, and to vote according to your interests, our collective interests, is the most effective thing you could possibly do. And so it's not a political discussion. It's actually just your engagement in a conversation that is about our shared future. And this is not something we can punt down the road to further elections. This really is a here and now imperative. So if you're not already politically engaged at whatever level makes sense for you, this is the number one thing you could possibly do. Number two thing you could do is mind your diet. So thinking about our emissions related to beef production, for example, a huge amount of resources goes into producing beef, and a huge amount of emissions are related to the dairy and beef industry. I know we know that well here at Cornell. Well, thinking about at least 1, 2, 3 days a week being plant-based collectively could have a huge impact on those emissions. So minding your diet, what you're eating, and where you're sourcing your food is a huge lever. And of course, where we put our capital matters a lot. And I'm not just talking investors like me managing millions and billions. I'm talking about where we put our savings, for example. So your top investment banks, for example, JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, are all investors in oil and gas infrastructure development, all of them, right? So thinking about where you put your savings, your deposits, your checking account, your investments, if you have them, your trusts, if you're so lucky, will really matter for where that capital goes and what those banks commit to developing. There are now impact-oriented banks. Some of them are online, some of them are brick and mortar, that pledge and tell you they will not deploy your capital that you've put in deposits into oil and gas development and infrastructure. Find those banks, right? And bank with them in ways that feels right for you and doesn't put you at Silicon Valley Bank level risk, but really gives us an opportunity to really think about our role in terms of the capital that we put to work, going to the right kind of development, going to fund managers like FullCycle, not necessarily the developers of oil and gas infrastructure. And then fourth, and I think I say this in a room full of go-getters, doers, and folks who are highly engaged and ambitious, your advocacy and your voice really matters. So beyond voting, how you actually share your actions on a daily basis will matter, whether you do it on TikTok or whether you do it, in a newsletter, or whether you do it on Instagram. It doesn't matter exactly what the platform is. It's more that you have the opportunity to share with others your approach towards voting, towards your diet, towards your capital, towards the things that you engage in as a part of an institution will really matter for what others feel galvanized and empowered to do in their own lives and in their own spheres of influence. And then, of course, there's institutional responsibility. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Cornell at Cornell. Of course, we've got the 2030 project, right? So much happening here out of Atkinson, so much happening here on campus, the geothermal efforts that have been instituted on campus. All of it's really great, but all of it is small compared to the amount of work that could be done at the endowment level. So Cornell's endowment, actually, I don't know the number. I'm assuming it's $10 to $15 billion, could do a lot of work in investing in low carbon infrastructure, in natural system restoration, and decarbonized solutions. And so while divestment did happen, right, there's a lot more we could be doing to make sure that portfolio that is contributed to by your dollars can be invested in places that are not carbon intensive, that are not emissions intensive. And so moving billions of dollars means that using your voice on campus is probably a good use of your time, right? It's a few investment professionals that are making decisions about your endowment, and hearing from you about where those dollars should be invested is by far and away the biggest lever of your voice here on campus, right? So where the dollars go really matters, and charging folks who are in charge of that capital to understand the problem and their role in it could be your role in changing the climate and addressing climate action. So I want to share with you kind of, some takeaways beyond that, which we've already discussed. Look, we all hear the news every day. We see the disasters on TV. We understand that climate's destabilizing. The diagnosis is poor. But the prognosis, we very much still have our hands, right? We can very much effectuate what happens next, and everybody plays a role. And so that's something to be hopeful for. And ultimately, I'm an optimist and I'm hopeful about our shared condition, about our future, and you should be too. But it's really important for us to develop a plan and to follow it, to prioritize those solutions, the order of operations that we talked about earlier, and the pathways that we can create for the future generations to take that baton and do even more really matter. Everyone plays a role, not everyone plays the same role. So what's your role? So that's what I've got for you today. I am so grateful to have shared my insights with you, and a little bit about what we're doing at the various entities. This is my first time kind of doing a lecture of this style that kind of incorporates all the work we're doing across FullCycle and Drawdown and Cornell Tech and the Astra project. So thank you for your time. Thank you guys for having me. Really appreciate it.
Okay, I think we have time for some questions. Please go ahead.
I don't know if this is like something we're supposed to know, but you mentioned something about contributors to SLCP emissions. Could you go into a little bit more what SLCP emissions are?
Yeah, so SLCP stands for short-lived climate pollutants. It's molecules like methane that are really powerful when you put them up into the atmosphere and then decline in their ability to warm the atmosphere over time, right? And so in thinking about methane or nitrous oxides, which come from fertilizer use, or refrigerants that are in our refrigerators and our air conditioners, the time frame in which we focus our attention really matter. Because if you focus on a 100-year arc and say, okay, well, it's not that big of a deal to focus on methane, it's only 20 times more heat trapping than CO2, which is still a gargantuan multiplier. It's actually not an accurate snapshot. So focusing on agriculture and waste and oil and gas gives us a chance to focus specifically on those short-lived climate pollutants and have the most impact per dollar invested, per unit of energy, in the shortened time frame in which we have to have that impact. So SLCPs are a key lever for us to identify what we can do and the order in which we do it.
Thank you.
Please.
Hi, first off, thank you. I'm wondering how big of an impact might larger financial institutions like the BlackRocks of the world would have compared to smaller VC firms in allocating capital towards climate? And kind of the second part of that is how do those conversations go in convincing kind of the movers and shakers traditionally towards allocating more capital over time sustainably?
Yeah, so it's a good question. The answer is a huge one, right? The BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the Fidelities of the world control trillions of dollars. And so their impact is massive. It's the impact you might have of a small country, frankly. And so again, customer voices matter a lot. And so the conversations that we typically have with these institutions is one of receptivity, because they realize there's a huge problem. They play a role and all eyeballs are on them. Everyone's asking that question, right? What role does BlackRock play here? The other thing I will share is the SEC, which governs kind of the investment ecosystem and universe, has now put out guidelines for reporting. So the same way you can go through BlackRock's website and see a 10K and understand exactly where they're putting their resources, you soon will be able to see the climate impact as they understand it of their investments. And so because you have reporting coming online, everyone's kind of getting their act together, dotting their I's, crossing their T's, or at least trying to figure out what their exposure is to not reporting correctly when they really need to. So you should look out for that. We're kind of in a year of a comment period, so we're deciding how that rule should be implemented. And after the fact, it's kind of like good accounting, right? Everyone has GAAP accounting principles on their books. You can understand the books very easily. It will be the same thing for climate reporting. And we build upon that and get more robust and more technically enabled, but that's going to take some time. But these firms play a huge role in how we deploy capital, and they can start to steer the ship almost single-handedly because they're so massive in terms of the amount of capital they've got and the number of companies and entities in which they invest. They're huge.
Okay, we have a question from the webinar. What is your company investing in to reduce methane in the agricultural sector, and what are promising options in that realm?
So we have one investment in sustainable ag. That's the Sustainatech company I mentioned earlier. That's our opportunity to think about more sustainable food production and land use that is more efficient, so you don't have kind of the waste and the practices that are methane intensive. But there's a lot we could be investing in. We still have more to do and more to go. And there's a lot of investments that are popping up in this sector. So one you might hear about a lot are called feed additives for the cows that are typically emitting methane in abundance. And so there's ways you can think about kelp-derived feed additives, seaweed-derived feed additives. When I say feed additives, I mean a little bit of powder or a pill in the general feed of the animals, garlic-derived feed additives that start to reduce the emissions of those animals, the methane emissions in particular, in very large numbers. And so there's a lot we could be investing in our ag sector, and there's a lot of funds that are focused on that area. So, ag is a huge lever. We have an opportunity to think about new investments. And again, kind of per the point of one of the slides, there's a lot of new technologies emerging that are not yet investable, but we hope someday will be. And we'll get a chance to deploy capital into those as well.
Good question there, please. Yeah.
For climate optimism, which you kind of talked about a little bit, how do you go about being able to be climate optimist, like in between climate optimism and climate optimism, where you are acknowledging that this is dire, but you're because you got to convince people who don't already know that it's a problem. It's a problem.
Yeah.
You're also supposed to be optimistic. Where do you find the middle ground?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a philosopher from the 70s and 80s named Bucky Fuller. And he wrote a book, How to Operate Spaceship Earth. If you haven't read it, I recommend you read it. And one of the things he says is, well, if we're all on a spaceship hurtling in a direction, you might best be equipped to understand how you navigate by figuring out how the systems work, right? By figuring out how you navigate, what the critical systems are. And thankfully, we've done all of that work. We know where the emissions are coming from. We know how to address most of those problematic areas, and we understand how the technology and the natural systems restoration can play its role in reducing those emissions. I think knowing what to do is 95% of the battle. It really is. 5% is actually doing the thing, and we have to do the thing. But understanding the nature of this problem to the level at which we currently do is not something that was even on the radar for most of us, but 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? A lot of you may have seen or at least referenced or heard referenced Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. I remember when Al Gore was going around with a slide deck, right? He didn't even have a movie yet. And he was trying to get people to move and take action. Those were days when you couldn't have conversations about CO2, let alone methane, let alone identifying where all these gases were coming from. So we've come a long way in a very short period of time. I think we have the capacity not only to know what to do, but to galvanize governments and private sector to do it. And having a plan really helps. So a roadmap for action is a really great tool for us to have in our pocket. Is it perfect? Probably not. Is it good enough to get us at least back on a curve to a world that we want to live into? I think it's really possible. And I think having not just optimism, but hope, right? Hope is this dimension that we don't often talk about, but we have to believe this is possible, right? We've got to not only believe it, but act as though it's possible, vote as though it's possible, challenge the systems as though it's possible, and deploy our capital as though it's possible. And if we do that, there's a lot to be optimistic about.
Up there, please.
How does your fund strike the balance between maximizing returns and investing in the most impactful companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is I would call it a fallacy in investment in the investment sector, that you have to have concessionary returns if you're investing in climate, right? That you can't swing for the fences and get 20, 30% return on your investment if you're investing in climate. That's wrong. And anyone who tells you that isn't looking at the market as they should be and doesn't see the opportunities that they should see. It's actually possible to have a tremendous amount of climate impact and carbon return on your investment, meaning how much carbon are we drawing down per investment, carbon and its equivalents, and inspiring financial returns that will galvanize trillions into this market. We are demonstrating that in our model, and there's now dozens of funds that are doing this work profitably, delivering returns to investors actively, that are still doing the most climate work possible. So we're really lucky to be in this time. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that was a little bit of an iffy question, right? Can you still invest and do the climate work that's necessary to be done? Today, it's a no-brainer, right? Every investment firm, every venture shop, every fund that you can imagine is now taking a look at climate seriously, because not only is it the right thing to be doing, one of the most profitable opportunities in a low carbon transition is probably our greatest economic and financial opportunity of our lifetimes, maybe ever, right? Every system has to be overhauled: power, waste, energy, agriculture, all of it. And so that transition, in great moments of transition, a lot of wealth can be created. And by framing it that way, you start to galvanize trillions of dollars into the market, because everyone wants an opportunity to create wealth. And if we can create that inclusively, we can also lift people up. We can also think about a more and wider constituency of folks who participate in that transition. And that's better for everyone. That means healthier retirement accounts, more savings. That means more capital flowing into markets. It's the best chance to bolster and support and grow our economy that we will ever see in our lifetimes.
Okay, a question from the webinar. Do you think the participation of big oil companies in COPs reduced their effectiveness, and insights into how big oil companies are investing in climate change mitigation?
I love that question. You guys, this is great. Okay, so there's a theory of change here. Not everyone loves it, but I think it's sound, which is we are not going to wish the oil and gas industry away. That's just not going to happen, right? And in fact, the most effective low carbon transition will likely benefit not only from the capital in their balance sheet, they have a lot of money, but also their engineering capacities and capabilities. You want to build offshore wind? You know who's been building in nearshore ecosystems for a really long time? The oil and gas industry. So the question to me is not, do they spoil the conversation? I think, I think we have to put really tight controls over how the oil and gas majors participate in a low carbon transition. You can't just do the business as usual practices as you have done in the past. That no longer will fly. But if you want to participate in that tremendous investment opportunity, if you want to participate in that huge and gargantuan low carbon transition, here are the things you oil and gas majors can and should be doing with your capital, with your engineering capacity and prowess, and your ability to effectuate change in markets. This is your chance to dive in and participate in something that otherwise would have been a harder transition without their inclusion. So I think with really tight controls, we can start to move those oil and gas majors into renewables in a way that helps us all, but we haven't put those controls in place yet. So does their participation in the COP ruin it? No, I don't think it ruins it. but I do think it distracts us from some of the issues that we need to focus on. So we need to put some lanes in place and say, okay, if you want to participate, this is how you do it. But you can't just do the extraction and everything else that you want to do. It turns out we have all of the proven reserves, oil and gas reserves, that we will ever need for a low carbon transition. We don't need to go drilling anymore, right? And so as good as the IRA is, this administration made a mistake 2 weeks ago and allowed for drilling on the Alaskan public lands that should not have been permitted. So there's a way to do this that brings in the positive resources and capacities for the oil and gas industry to participate, and there's ways to not do it. We've got to get that balance right. We don't quite have it right yet, but I think we can get it right.
Face up there.
Yeah, hi. So I think a lot of emphasis was placed on like methane drawdown and mitigation. I was wondering like how bad like other SLCPs like nitrous oxide and CFCs relative to methane, and are other SLCPs easy to remove?
So, every gas has its sources, right? So nitrous oxides, for example, come from fertilizer use. So you see that coming out of agriculture, for example. I don't think anything's easy to reduce. It's all going to take systems-wide transformation. But the reason methane is such a key focus for so many of us is it's not just about the warming potential of the molecule, it's about the volume of methane that we emit from systems that operate every single day in every part of the world, 24/7, 7 days a week. So there's an opportunity there to really focus a small amount for the amount of mass that we emit of methane. A large amount of impact can be had by focusing on that attention, on that area. Nitrous oxide is a really important one. It's actually 300 times more heat trapping than CO2. It's just volumetrically less, and I think it's a little bit more difficult to mitigate because most farms are not the big operations that we know of in this country. They're usually a lot smaller, and so it's a distributed problem that we've got to figure out. Refrigerants are also really important. Some of you may have heard of the Montreal Protocol. So that was an agreement out of a COP in Montreal that allowed us to actually close the hole in the ozone layer that was being driven by HFCs and CFCs to a lesser extent. And that was global agreements happening in coordination at its finest, at its best. We actually did that work and have now diminished the hole in the ozone layer that was a result of those refrigerants being emitted. And so there's a real example of how you actually can take action collectively at the international level and reduce those gases. It's just refrigerants are a small amount of the warming relative to the mass that's emitted. Methane's a much bigger piece. So it pays to focus on methane, but we've got to think about the other SLCPs as well. It's a great question.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. Matt, please. Right by the stairs, yeah, please.
You talk about capital, but do you think that we're gonna have to kind of address certain systems, such as like capitalism, in terms of fighting the climate crisis?
Can you say it for me one more time, focusing on capitalism?
I said, like, because capitalism has largely been linked to like the climate crisis. Do you think we're gonna have to divest from that system in terms of creating a future?
I love that question.
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, so the question is, capitalism got us here. Is it the right tool to get us out of it? More or less, right? Look, I think there's, someone asked earlier about being optimistic. I think that's important. I think being pragmatic is also really important. We live in an economy, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But what we can do is take every tool we've got by virtue of a capitalistic economy and point it at the opportunities to reduce emissions and stabilize our climate. It turns out capitalism can be a fantastic tool, right, for taking this climate action that's necessary if we point our markets, our funds, our capital at the work that needs to be done. And if we do so with our hands on not just the investments and the technology, but on a just transition, right? So using capitalism as a tool for development, for sustainability, for peace is a really effective way. And it's probably the best and highest use of this system that we call capitalism that's global. But there's no transforming that system in the shortened timeframe in which we have to fix climate. And in fact, capitalistic entities have interest in stabilizing the climate, right? No one cares more about coastal real estate and rising sea levels than the people who own commercial real estate in Miami Beach, for example. So we can use it as a tool to effectuate as much change as possible. And we have our hands on the wheels of capitalism. We know how to deploy that capital today. So it's the tool we've got, it's the systems we've built, and it's how we can think about a low carbon transition that's ambitious and achievable.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.